All right, Sarai, do you want to give a couple more minutes, or do you want to let me know when you want to kick us off?
Great. And do we have all the attendees now in the meeting, or a good group?
We're at 67 and counting. We could give it another minute if you want, or we have all the, I think we have all the Brattle and D&V staff here.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Zerai Hagos, Deputy Director of the Office of Markets and Innovation at the New York State Department of Public Service, and I'd like to welcome you to the second technical conference in the Grid of the Future proceeding, which was initiated by the Public Service Commission in April of this year. The primary objective of the Grid of the Future proceeding is to develop an ongoing utility planning process that encourages investment in flexible resources, which can in turn help achieve New York's clean energy goals at, quote, a manageable cost and at the highest levels of reliability. The initiating order outlined 3 major phases of the proceeding with deliverables in 2024 and 2025. The first phase of the Grid of the Future proceeding, which was the focus of the September 27th technical conference, is the Grid Flexibility Study, which will provide an assessment of the present and future capabilities of flexible resources in New York. The study will also identify recommendations to enable greater levels of grid flexibility. The focus of today's meeting is the development of the first Grid of the Future plan, which today's presenters will describe in more detail in just a few minutes. Today's presentations will be led by our consultants at DNV and Brattle, who are supporting staff with the development of the Phase 1 and Phase 2 work. You'll have a chance to see the methodology we plan to use to assess the distributed system implementation plans in advance of the filings during today's meeting. I'll also use this opportunity to inform those of you who have not yet seen the notice in DMM that the Secretary granted an extension to the due dates for Phases 1 and 2 of this proceeding. The modified due date for the Grid Flexibility Study, or Phase 1, is January 31st of 2025. The modified due date for the first Grid of the Future plan, or Phase 2 of the proceeding, is at the end of February of 2025. These timing adjustments were necessary to allow for additional time needed to better align the input assumptions into the Phase 1 study, which in turn form Phase 2 of the work. As was the case in our previous technical conference, I would like to extend a sincere thanks to each of you for taking the time on a Friday afternoon to engage in the Grid of the Future proceeding. We have time reserved for questions at the end of the formal presentations today, and we ask that you enter questions into the chat throughout the meeting, and we'll address them during that Q&A portion at the end of the meeting. And without further ado, I'll now hand the meeting over to our first presenter, Kelly, from DNV, to kick off the meeting. Kelly, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I just want to say that we are, as a team, we are really excited to be here and grateful to be participating in this really exciting project focused on New York's Grid of the Future. So just a few things on the agenda. We'll give a few team introductions quickly. I will provide an overview of the project, although Zerai already did a wonderful job of that. Then we'll go into the 3 main pieces of the Phase 2 work that we'll be discussing today: the 2023 DSIP assessment, the key DSIP elements assessment, and the DSIP regulatory assessment. Then we'll come back to talk a little bit about next steps. And again, we'll open the floor for Q&A. We'll be reading the questions and responding to those. Next slide. So just some team introductions. I'll be doing the introductions for the Brattle team, and then I'll pass it, or for the D&B team, and then I'll pass it to Ryan to introduce the Brattle team. So I'm Kelly Marin. I am a principal consultant at D&B. I'm located in California. I have about 20 years of industry experience. I actually started on the utility side over here on the West Coast at Southern California Edison, and then transitioned into consulting about 15 years ago. And my main focus has really been on demand response and demand flexibility, among other things over that time. I am the D&B project manager. I am also joined today by Teague Douglas. She's going to be sharing this presentation with me, so you'll be hearing from her. She is our DSIP assessment lead, and she's really been driving a lot of work that's underlying a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about today and sharing with you this afternoon. We're also joined by Karen Crampton. She is our regulatory and policy lead, and she's also our project sponsor, really overseeing all the work that the D&B team is doing in support of this project. Ryan, I'll pass it to you to introduce the Brattle team.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Ryan Luddick. I'm a principal with the Brattle Group. I'm overall director of this project. You heard from me on the first stakeholder webinar where we got into some of the methodology that we're using to conduct the phase 1 potential study that Zarai was describing. So great to be here with you all again. And I'm joined by my colleague, Akila Sharmakrishnan, who's a managing associate in our Toronto office. Many of you have probably already heard from Akilish either through the stakeholder interviews that we've been conducting in the context of the phase 1 work, or also the stakeholder survey that we had sent out recently through this engagement as well. Akilish and I will mostly be in the background on this one, but available during Q&A. And then our colleague Kate Peters is busily working on the potential study as we speak. So great to be here with you all again.
Thanks, Ryan. All right, next slide. So we'll do a little bit on the project overview. Again, Zarai gave a very nice introduction of this, so I will just touch on it briefly. There are 3 key phases. Phase 1, as was mentioned earlier, the focus is really on the grid flexibility study itself. The Brattle team obviously presented on that during our last technical conference, and that study is focused on estimating the cost-effective, achievable potential for the grid flexibility in the state. Phase 2, which will result in the first iteration or sort of the foundation of the Grid of the Future plan, will leverage the results of the flexibility study, and we're going to be really focused on the development of a more expansive DSIP process that aligns with the goals of this proceeding. Phase 3 is where it's really all going to come together, right? And that's going to result in the full Grid of the Future plan, which will include a long-term vision and roadmap for grid flexibility. On the next slide, just digging in a little bit more on phase 2, these are the 3 different assessments that we're really kind of focused on sharing the methodology with you all during this technical conference. The first assessment is really sort of a backward-looking review of the DSIPs. We're also going to be focused and share our methodology around prioritizing the elements for future DSIPs, for the development of DSP plans. And then the third piece is really focused on updating the DSIP guidance for the utilities going forward. And again, all of that will result in this sort of first iteration or sort of the underlying foundation of the full Grid of the Future plan. All right, so before we jump in too much, just wanted to give a background, not sure where everybody is coming from on the DSIPs, just to give you some information on what they are and what they're for and what their history is. So DSIP stands for Distributed System Implementation Plan. It is a filing that came out of the 2015 REV proceeding, and they are filings that the utilities are required to file on a biannual basis, and they started back in 2016. So the utilities have already been through a few rounds of these filings coming up to the 2023 filing. The purpose of these filings is really for the utilities to have a place to share their progress and their plans that will support the implementation of the distributed system platform, which is designed to enable this transition to the grid of the future. The filings themselves are really organized around 13 different technical topics. And the 13 technical topics are there in the figure sort of on the right-hand side of the slide. And the guidance coming from the DPS helps to create a consistent format for the utilities to address these different topics. Each utility has a sort of executive summary section in the beginning where they provide an overview of their plan. And then the remainder of that DSIP is pretty focused on responding to the prompts that come from the DSP guidance. And within each of the technical topics, there are 4 sort of general prompts. So within something like integrated planning, there are prompts that are requesting background information, context, current progress, future plans. And then it goes into a set of detailed prompts that are specific and unique to each technical topic. And there can be up to 15 different prompts across those topics. So that's just a quick background of the DSIPs. They're all out there publicly available. Great evening reading for those of you that are interested. Next slide. So now we'll dig in a little bit. I'm going to actually present the methodology for the first piece or the first assessment, which is the 2023 DSIP assessment, and then I'll be handing it off to Teek to present on some of the other assessments that we're doing. So for the 2023 DSIP assessment, this is really a backward-looking assessment. The objective is to determine how well each of the utility filings aligns with the DPS guidance. And at this point, we want you to keep in mind that we're not concerned with determining sort of the impact or maturity of the plans or solutions that are being proposed in the filings, but we're really focused on how well the utilities responded to the individual prompts. Another part of this assessment is for us as sort of an independent party to look at the guidance itself and look for areas where maybe it could be streamlined or clarified or otherwise improved. The approach that we took was to develop really as simple a scorecard as we could with all of those individual prompts. I have some examples in the next coming slides. But the purpose of that scorecard is really, again, to understand how well each DSIP is aligned with the guidance. And then within our project team, we recruited a group of reviewers that are subject matter experts within each of the various technical topics and asked them to review both across the utilities, but within topics. And so that way we're trying to build consistency in the way that we're reviewing across the utilities, but also building in sort of that expertise within each topic. And that's giving us kind of a consistent perspective across those topics. And then we ask the reviewers to provide their rationale. Another really important piece is that we're going to be conducting, coming up very soon, one-on-one meetings with each of the utilities. So once the scorecards are completed, we'll be providing those to the utilities and giving them an opportunity to respond to those scorecards. And then we'll be meeting with them one-on-one so that not only can they ask us questions about our scoring and we can provide them maybe more detailed feedback if they have questions, but we also want to get feedback from the utilities on the DSIP process itself, because that will help us as we're looking to provide recommendations to the DPS for future DSIP guidance. All right, next slide. So getting more into the scorecard itself. This is just a little bit of background on the scorecard. So again, we kind of talked about the purpose already, but the format, these scorecards are in Excel. They have a summary tab up front that sort of summarizes the official scorecard across all the technical topics. And then there are 13 individual tabs, one for each of the technical topics that are described in the guidance. And the scoring is below there, you can see. There are sort of 2 elements. There's sort of a check or a slash. If information was provided, then it got a check. If no information was provided, it gets a slash and has that sort of gray hash or striped shading in the cell. And then for each prompt, we also provided a rating. And the ratings are this kind of yellow, dark blue, or green, with the yellow meaning that there was some evidence indicating that the DSIP followed the guidance. The blue is sufficient evidence that the DSIP followed the guidance, and then the green would represent like really good job, nice discussion of ideas, or something that's aligning with industry best practice. So on the next slide, we have 2 more slides describing the scorecard. The next slide shows an example of one of those individual topic specific tabs. So this would be like a scored technical topic. I chose energy efficiency and integration and innovation. It has the fewest number of prompts, so it fit nicely on a single slide. And these individual tabs are designed to let the user see the scoring related to those specific prompts, and then also the rationale of the reviewers, right? So you can see the prompt is there on the left. There's a check on all of these indicating that the utility responded, and then we have the scoring. So in this case, 3 of them were sufficient. 1 was sort of very little detail was provided, so it has yellow, and then the green would be details on multiple programs and links, so that one was scored green. And just so everyone knows, these are just examples. This isn't actually a scorecard for any particular utility. We just wanted to give an example of the methodology and what the scorecard looks like. No, that's good. Next slide is perfect. This is our last one for this. This is an example of the cumulative scorecard. So this is where you can see across all of the technical topics where the DSIP is excelling and where there's room for improvement. In this one, the technical topics go across the top. So you can see those 13 that I had on a previous slide: integrated planning, advanced forecasting, all the way down to beneficial location for DERs. And then the prompts are going up and down. So the 4 common prompts are at the top. You can see context and background, risks and mitigation, stakeholder engagement. And then prompts 1 through 15 represent those individual prompts that would be specific to that particular topic. And if there's a cell that's not shaded, it just means that there wasn't a prompt. So I used the energy efficiency one. It doesn't have as many prompts. It only has 5. So for 4.7, you can see there's a lot of white space. That just means that there weren't as many very specific prompts for that. Advanced forecasting happens to have the most, so it's got it shaded all the way to the bottom. And then you can see the yellow, where it needs improvement, and the green where we're looking at industry best practice. And I think with that, we're going to hand it off to Teague to talk a little bit about the other assessments that we've been working on.
Awesome. Thank you, Kelly. So I'm going to introduce the next 2 assessments. So as Kelly said, all these assessments are really driving towards, 1, creating the foundation for phase 3 and doing that first iteration of the Grid of the Future plan. And it's also to provide recommendations and insights for updating the DPS guidance, which informs these DSIP plans. So yeah, while the last assessment really is, current state of the DSIPs, where are we seeing a lot of progress? Where is feedback available? Where can they be improved? This key elements assessment is really our first stab at future looking and adding dimensionality and a maturity and a time scale to our assessment of the DSIPs. So what are the key elements? Identify and prioritize elements that must be timely implemented to support achievement of the New York State's decarbonization objectives. And so we're going to apply those key elements to the DSIPs to really look at, how are these plans driving towards creating a distribution system platform that does enable that decarbonization. So some of the things that we've been thinking about is, how do we make these key elements as useful as possible, help setting us up for that phase 3 and provide the insights that we need going forward. 1, it should be simple, easy to use, and really guide where investments should be when it comes to creating that DSP to create, meaningful contribution to that overall decarbonization goal. You know, it needs to be flexible, right? So not every utilities investment is going to look the same, or their progression is going to look the same. So that framework really needs to be focused on, you know, driving outcomes and capabilities and vision, as opposed to being you know, very, very specific in how to get there. And so, yeah, so I think I'll go a little bit into how we're going to create this key elements framework, and then how we're going to use it. So I have the six kind of elements that we're looking to for creating the key elements. First is, you know, there's a lot of industry best practices around distribution planning, grid modernization, DSO work, right? So not going to reinvent the wheel, but really use a lot of the body of work around, you know, how do you effectively move into these capabilities from your, you know, ground zero or your baseline or business as usual. We also are going to look to, you know, make sure that this does align with the legislative requirements where possible on the distribution side. So again, these key elements really need to be looking towards almost predicting what's going to be in that roadmap out of phase 3. So making sure that when we're talking about what is meaningful and prioritized, that it does ensure alignment with, you know, where we're trying to head at that state level. And then also, you know, look towards the regulatory proceedings that are occurring in New York. Those are a really good signpost of what's meaningful and important when it comes to unlocking potential. So we want to take that into account. And of course, our phase 1 study, right? There was both a quantification or interview component and survey component, as well as the actual flexibility study. So for, you know, both of those are really good inputs for where the industry stakeholders and utilities really see possibility and meaningful change. So, you know, very much going to take that into consideration. And then finally, you know, the DSIP work to date and those 13 technical topics, as well as, you know, the conversations we've had with different stakeholders. Again, all those things are going to be guiding forces for this key elements framework. So this is a example of what that framework might look like, right? Again, we're adding that scale of maturity and progression. You know, the current guidance is very much a plan in progress. And so this is where we're adding, you know, dimensionality to how we think about, you know, what is important in those filings and how they, you know, lead, how they can be tied to the key goals around decarbonization and creating new capabilities on the distribution system. So a couple things to point out here. The key elements, you know, we're going to keep it simple. You know, it's going to be, again, based on industry best practices and a logical grouping so that this framework is easy to use, easy to understand, and very much relates to internal distribution planning practices. We're going to, you know, create the capabilities and mechanisms of how you move along that maturity scale to help create, again, outcomes and vision, right? We want to make sure that each investment is meaningful and that we are focused on the right things when it comes to, you know, achieving that DSP. And then how are we going to use it? So again, why did we put this element into the process? Why did we create this? It allow us to, again, start to do a forward-looking assessment of the current DSIPs. So starting to baseline where all of the utilities plans are at, and, you know, the level of maturity, and, you know, what's possible with those. It'll also provide, you know, insights and recommendations for updating the guidance. So where can the guidance provide more clarity, more support, more of that roadmap vision. And then, yeah, phase 3, right? So phase 3 is about understanding where we're at, where we want to go, and how we get there. And this key elements framework will be that first approach to that progression of how we get there at the DSIP level, right? There will obviously, that vision and roadmap will obviously include, you know, market level actions and opportunities, but the DSIPs are a real core part of achieving those goals and that vision. And so this key elements will be that guiding force for the DSIPs in supporting that phase 3. All right, now we're going to go to the third assessment in phase 2, the regulatory assessment. So the regulatory assessment is a bit different. It's not a DSIP specific assessment. It's really looking at the market, the regulatory environment in New York. The goals of this is to really understand, what in that regulatory environment is supporting or hindering the activities in the DSIPs, or more broadly, the ability to develop that DSP. So this assessment is both, activities directly taken on in the DSIPs, but also, activities that might be upstream of those DSIPs activities. So again, really looking at the whole regulatory environment versus, specific activities that are within the DSIPs themselves. As part of that assessment, we want to understand, are the barriers being addressed? Are they being partially addressed? What's left kind of to be addressed? And then also, where are we making progress? Where has, the regulatory environment supported these activities and the ability to achieve? The end goal is to really have a very good understanding of, where there's opportunity to remove more barriers, and where things are working. And that will be, again, foundational for phase 3 as far as, prioritizing what needs to be addressed to be successful in achieving the overall goals. So just a couple notes on the assessment approach. Took, kind of industry practices around, what are the barriers, what are the tailwinds. We then looked at, both federal and state regulatory efforts to see where some of those barriers and tailwinds are being addressed, and then created a comprehensive view of that. So I have one example for you all of what the output will look like. So we'll provide both, detailed by barrier, by tailwind, what we're seeing in the regulatory environment in New York, but we'll also have a high-level roll-up view of, where there's still, very high barriers or low barriers, and again, another component to support a roadmap for us in the future. So this one, project cost allocation, this is a upstream of, what is detailed in the DSIPs. But, this one is, we've said, oh, there's, high impact because there's no clear methodology assigned to this value. And then here's some of the proceedings that have touched on it or have addressed it. And the outcomes to support that rationale and to support the fact that, this could potentially still be a barrier in the market for achieving some of the goals outlined. All right. So I'm going to hand it back to Kelly, and I'll probably see you in the Q&A.
Yeah, great. So that was, covering those 3 key assessments that we're working on. In the next steps, we just have some information on, next slide. There we go. On some additional technical conferences. So the next one that you'll see is a technical conference to actually present the potential study results and review those for phase 1. Then we'll also be presenting the results of phase 2 and how that's going to help align with sort of the grid of the future plan, first iteration. Again, just a few notes below. I already kind of spoke to this on how these pieces are all going to fit together. And then we have some other outreach that's ongoing. I mentioned the one-on-one DSIP scorecard meetings with the utilities. They should start seeing some emails from me looking for times on the schedule coming up very soon. I think we have a few expert interviews maybe still going on with Ryan and the Brattle team. And then that stakeholder survey is, I believe, out. So that you all can respond to that and give us more information on barriers and solutions. But that's all we had for today. Really just going through the methodology so that you all are prepared when we have the results of these different assessments to share. We didn't have a lot in the chat, but we'll give a few minutes in case something comes to mind for anybody, any questions that anybody wanted to ask. Go ahead and type them in, and we'll respond.
I'm seeing, this is Karen. Hi, I'm seeing one question that is probably best directed to DPS. Why don't I read that? Besides the utility-specific DSIPs, what opportunities are there to explore statewide rate design reform in the Grid of the Future plan, such as implementing a bidirectional tariff or flexible resources?
I can get started and I'll invite others from DPS staff to chime in. I think the first and most obvious place would be in response to the grid flexibility study that Brattle is working on and will be filed on January 31st of 2025. If our report will attempt to identify the major barriers to enabling more flexible services. And I think, you can either attach comments to one of those barriers that are identified, or if it's missed, we would welcome comments about barriers that we missed in some way. And that's, I think, the quickest and most direct way to get that type of comment before the commission in the Grid of the Future proceeding. I don't think that there are other proceedings that are happening in parallel where that may also come up, particularly bidirectional. But anyways, that's my first take, is in response to the grid flexibility study that'll be filed at the end of January. It may be a barrier that is highlighted in the report, and if it's not, commenters are welcome to let us know what we missed.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that question, or should we go to the next?
Hi, this is Andy Owens. I would just add that the topic of rate design impacts future is something that is very much in the scope of work for phase 3. So there will be I think a very complete evaluation of things, of rate design aspects that have an effect on whether or not we get to the grid of the future that we would like to see. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to the next question. Teague, I think this one is for you. Will the regulatory assessment include an evaluation of existing compensation programs and wholesale market participant rules?
Yeah, I can take that one. I mean, definitely phase 1 has reviewed and gone in depth with several of industry stakeholders around, the market rules and participation, and maybe even, plans of where it could be improved, et cetera. So the regulatory review, where it does hit a proceeding or, a FERC order, we are reviewing it. But I would say that topic area kind of hits on a lot of different steps, within this project. And then, also, in phase 3, where we're saying, here's the current status of those markets and what's available, and maybe where those markets need to head and go to achieve the potential that we want.
Great, thanks, Teague. Anybody else want to weigh in? Okay. Sorry, I'm scanning through a few of these to see what I can group together. We're getting a number of them in the chat. Yeah, so just looking for a good question here about trying to confirm what and what not the grid of the future will look at, the grid of the future study will look at, and looking for confirmation that it will not include the forward capacity market.
I can get started on this one. I'm thinking this is about front of the meter distributed energy resources, like batteries connected directly into the distribution system somewhere, but not behind a meter. And this came up in the previous technical conference, and I think it is true that the grid flexibility study is not specifically modeling that use case. But we did clarify in that meeting that policies that support or alleviate barriers for those kinds of resources are in scope in this proceeding, and comments in response to that first filing can address those use cases, and the commission is interested in hearing ways to improve the rate designs and other, I guess, supportive mechanisms for that would encourage that type of resource for participating in our markets. But I think it's more of an issue of the amount of time we had to do the study and the types of tools that we're using to develop that initial flexibility study. One thing that we didn't mention in that first meeting, and I wish we had, is that the tools and resources we have for planning in and of itself may be a useful topic to address in this proceeding, and would be welcome to get feedback in terms of methodologies and frameworks that may be more flexible for these types of resources. I think there's not a tremendous amount of planning tools that cover really detailed DER and integrated into traditional grid planning tools. There are some, but they're pretty cutting edge. So the planning and how DER is represented in planning is something that we do attempt to address, particularly in the phase 3 grid of the future plan, the second plan that's due at the end of 2025.
This is right. Thank you. Okay, we've got a number of questions that are coming in that are targeted at the DSIPs. Does it seem like the DSIPs have many areas for improvement? So that may be part of our initial assessment. I don't know if we're prepared to answer that one at this point, but does anybody want to weigh in on the initial findings?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can say that yeah, I wouldn't say they have many. I think that each utility has different, their scoring is different, and across all different 13 technical topic areas, I would be very surprised if there weren't any areas for improvement. But overall, the example that I showed, I feel like is pretty representative. For the most part, the DSIPs are very responsive to the guidance, and are, either having, enough or like really good responses. But of course, there are some areas where things can be improved. So that's still a general answer, but hopefully that sheds a little light.
And I'll just add, while this assessment is important and does provide feedback, a lot of this assessment is trying to figure out how to most effectively fold this DSIP process into the goals of the Grid of the Future project, right? So, there are places for improvement, whether it be clarity, more detail, et cetera. But ultimately, these reviews are also giving us insight in how to improve the process for all stakeholders and align it with this bigger Grid of the Future project.
Okay, thank you. There are some questions regarding a question as to why we're evaluating the 2023 guidance, which is likely going to change through the Grid of the Future process. And what are the potential outcomes from the regulatory review? Any insights on that?
So I guess the first question around the 2023, it's really helping our team baseline and understand, what it is that all the utilities are actively pursuing and spending time on. So, that's really supportive for us to understand, again, if we're progressing towards this new vision for the grid of the future, where is everyone starting from, and how do we best align those activities with our goal? So a little bit of repetitive of what I just said, but again, there is some really useful information for us to understand and how the progression of the DSIPs has occurred. And then the second one, Karen, can you repeat around the regulatory outcomes, I think was the question?
Yeah, it was around the regulatory outcomes. What are the potential outcomes from the regulatory review? How is the Grid of the Future study, DSIPs, and regulatory review connected? I think it goes back to a little bit of the presentation you were giving on, but I'll let you fill in the blanks.
Yeah, so been using the word roadmap a lot, but the regulatory review gives us a comprehensive understanding of the New York regulatory environment and where there's still barriers to accomplishing the activities and goals in the DSIP. So, right, if our goal is to develop these new capabilities to create a DSP to, lead to decarbonization, that regulatory review is going to help us identify where there's still places that are holding us back from that goal, as well as where we're making progress and, we should continue forward.
Great, thank you. We did, going back up to just getting off of the technical topics, but just looking at the timeline, there was a question as to what's the overall timeline for this project? When should some results be shown and known? So Kelly, that one might go to you. Whoops, I'm not hearing you, Kelly, sorry. And it does appear you're off mute.
I'm on mute. I like to talk on mute. So for just phase 2? Or for the whole project?
Specific. Will there, just, I think it was the entire process that we're going through for phase 1 and phase 2. Can we just give just a quick overview of what months we are expecting some of the deliverables?
Yeah, that might actually be a good one for Ryan.
For Ryan.
Sure. Yeah, no, so on phase 1, I think a second stakeholder meeting was just announced for, I believe, December 10th, where we're going to be giving a qualitative preview of what we're seeing in the initial results of the potential study. I think that just came out. So that's really the next step on phase 1. And then as Zarai said at the beginning, end of January is when that report will be filed with the final results. And then Kelly, I don't know if there's more detail you want to add. Yeah.
For phase 2, we'll be doing probably a second technical conference like this one, sort of paralleling the phase 1 results in the new year. I would expect in January. We don't have that on the schedule yet. And then we're looking for final report at the end of February for phase 2.
Okay. We had a question on hosting capacity that I see Zarai can respond to, and I'm looking for that question now so I can read it to you. Or Zarai, if you
I
have
just found it. Yeah.
Okay.
Will there be an opportunity to propose an expansion of the DSIP process, specifically to include a process for proactive long-term system planning to enable hosting capacity for distributed generation? And yeah, and the answer that I would give there is it's really the utilities are legally responsible for long-term planning to enable and support the CLCPA, the goals of the CLCPA. And the coordinated grid planning process is it currently, is established to do just that. If I were a DG developer, I would probably be feeling like that process is very focused on transmission right now and could do a better job of predicting where distributed generation is going to go versus how they're this versus the way they're approaching it in this first cycle. But distributed generation is identified as an input into the long-term generation plans that are then generating T&D upgrade proposals in the back end of the CGPP right now. To an earlier point I made, I mean, I think we could. It would be interesting to explore the right time to bring in more innovation to the types of planning tools and methods we use to do that planning. But as an anecdote, I'll note that I've heard that the first batch of the little over $4 billion worth of areas of concern transmission projects that were funded in that proceeding, that actually a lot of DG solar has been consuming the headroom that was created by those first projects. So they were again much more designed with bulk solutions, bulk generation in mind, but distributed generation has been leveraging those upgrades and coming back to my initial point, it's really the CGPP that is a planning process that's designed to unbottle parts of the state where where there are large amounts of development of renewable generation and other types of clean sources, and that's the planning process. We expect that type of work to fit into in the kind of the long run, but Grid of the Future is a good point. Is a good venue to identify shortcomings in direct improvements to that planning process versus the DSIP, which I think we're looking to do other types of to advance other types of planning in that planning process. And Stephanie did point out that the order does envision in the initiating order for the Grid of the Future proceeding does envision feeding in recommendations to the CGPP or the coordinated grid planning process for this exact use case.
Okay, thank you, Sarai. This may be another one for you. So will the utilities be able to update their DSIPs once they are scored, or in our case, assessed?
This one is a bit of there's an awkward timing here because the utilities do have a 2-year requirement. However, we were discussing this issue this week with the utilities, and I think we need to take that back because I think it certainly makes sense to have the DSIPs updated once the commission acts on the recommendations in the phase 2 plan that gets filed in February, and so I think we need some more time to get a better answer for exactly how that will work, because as of now, based on the current commission orders, the utilities are responsible for getting another filing out there. So perhaps in our next check-in with this group, we'll have a better answer. But we do acknowledge that it makes sense for the filing to happen, the commission to update kind of the guidance for how DSIPs should work in the future, which is coming, and it would make sense to have the next DSIPs filed after that advice is provided by the commission and clarified by the commission.
Great, thank you. Let's switch directions a little bit. We do have a question that came in regarding the surveys. So Ryan, a question as to whether or not when the surveys are complete, whether there'll be available a summary of responses.
Yeah, we are planning on including that in the phase one report. The phase one report will cover our quantitative estimates of the potential, and it'll also get into our initial assessment of barriers and solutions. And in that discussion of the barriers and solutions, we're planning on providing kind of the takeaways and themes from the results of that survey. So it's feeding directly into that.
Great, thank you. I think we're nearing the end on a lot of our technical questions. We did just get a question, just a procedural question. Is there a way to submit written comments to inform the draft Grid of the Future plan before it is released? I'm thinking that's a question for DPS.
Zarad, I might be able to take this one. Rob Cully from DPS. I think these sort of stakeholder sessions are really our main avenue for gathering stakeholder input for the Grid of the Future, the first phase one Grid of the Future potential study. But we do have a requirement to go and take comment on that and incorporate those comments into what will be phase, I believe it's phase 3, which will be a refinement and more concrete goals than just what's included in phase 1.
Okay, thank you. And I'll also note that there'll be a notice and comment period where stakeholders can make suggestions and comments on the filings. So once things are filed, there'll definitely be a comment period available. Okay, we have another technical type question. To what extent is gas infrastructure being considered in the Grid of the Future proceeding?
As of right now, the proceeding is focused on the electric system and creating flexibility through grid edge resources. I think it's a interesting question because the sort of gas electric coordinated planning, that is something that I think we don't have a good forum that's kind of coordinating that, a cohesive plan there in all cases, though certainly the utility rate cases are keeping in mind investments in the gas and electric system in the case where there's combination gas and electric utilities. There's also a gas planning proceeding, which is developing specific gas plans for the gas utilities in the state and requirements that non-pipe alternative resources are used. The maturity of non-pipe alternatives in the state is not as advanced as non-wires alternatives, where I think we have more of a robust and proven model. So, I'd say the gas planning proceeding, there is a lot of work happening right at this second to develop and encourage non-pipe alternatives to as an alternative to leak-prone pipes and other suitable use cases for those types of solutions in the gas system. But I think, the kind of broader integration of something like the coordinated grid planning process, grid of the future, and the gas planning proceedings is a topic that we would, I think, invite comment on in this proceeding. And I think there's opportunities to be better integrated, and we would like to hear from stakeholders on that.
I think one addition to that I would make, Zerai, Rob Cully again from staff, is that the flexibility study and subsequent phases of this effort will certainly consider impacts and needs related to electrification. So to the extent that the electric and gas planning processes are linked through that kind of common element, there will be a connection there as well.
Okay, thank you. I am scanning through. I'm not, oops. Sorry, I'll give me a minute. I'm scrolling through to see what I've missed. Okay, I've got one for reporting. So this is probably Kelly or Teague. Do we think DSIP will include reporting on targets outlined in phase 1, or will that be done separately?
For forward looking, potentially, and I think that in the way that phase 1 will ultimately tie into phase 3. So I think we do envision that there will be a closer tie between the DSIPs and the vision and the goals that are established in phase 3 in an effort to move in that direction away from just sharing progress and towards something that's more outcome oriented. Anybody else want to weigh in on that one? You're welcome.
Thank you, Kelly. Hearing no one else wanting to respond in. All right, let's take a look at if we can talk about at all about the connection between this NYSERDA and the NYSERDA IEDR effort. Is that anybody? It's probably a focus more on the DPS.
Andy was, I don't know if Andy lost audio, but I'll note I can't hear him cut off as I think he was beginning to address that question. I'll admit that I understand part of that question, but this NYSERDA pond, I'm not sure there are so many NYSERDA ponds that I think we would need a clarification on what pond that person was referring to. In the IEDR, we do currently publish hosting capacity maps and load serving capacity maps that span the full state right now as part of the phase 1 implementation of that integrated energy data resource. And I think that's perhaps this person was asking about, the question of how Grid of the Future may relate to that effort to expose information to market participants. I so I don't think I think we would invite, I think we would invite stakeholders to certainly identify ways that greater access to data can support flexible the deployment of flexible resources. Ultimately, there's a separate proceeding for the integrated energy data resource and the data access framework. And we are developing many more use cases of data that are going to be available in that resource. And so Grid of the Future is really an overarching proceeding that is developed to thread all these disparate proceedings together in a form that ultimately steers the ship towards practical policies that encourage investment in DER and flexible services. So so it's probably hard to hear sometimes to go to this proceeding if you're looking to make a specific change to IEDR. I think like you can use your judgment about in comments when you're responding to our plan or the study, whether you want to reference something like IEDR, or if it's something that you have really specific feedback for. It may make sense to go over to that separate proceeding and become a stakeholder and really begin developing in detail the IEDR. I don't think there's no right or wrong answer. But I think again, Grid of the Future is that overarching proceeding, and depending on what your objective is, it may make more sense to make recommendations here. But if you want to roll up your sleeve and kind of get involved in those phase 2 use cases and kind of what becomes available immediately, the IEDR proceeding is really the right forum for that.
Thanks, Sarai. That was a good, thorough response. I'm sorry I unmuted in the wrong place. So the one thing I would add is that it's certainly possible and desirable if the Grid of the Future work identifies enhancements or new use cases for the IEDR. That's definitely something that we would hope to see some of that coming out of the work. So there's a linkage in that respect. But I would say, just like Sarai said, if you're interested in having more direct impact on what's going on in the IEDR program, then it should happen through events and processes in that IEDR program.
Well, thank you both for taking a stab at that one, not knowing what pond and the process, and talking about just kind of the regulatory process and what's the sequence of everything. There was a question that came in indicating that in the initiating order, there was a discussion of the potential to develop rate offerings targeting customers who electrify. how will that fit into the current schedule for this docket?
I'll take that. Rob Cully from staff. I think that would happen sometime following the flexibility study, and probably part of um, the phase 3 discussions leading up to that effort. So I think we would want to see the results of the flexibility study first, and then start the work of designing rates and programs to help achieve the goals and outcomes desired, identified in that flexibility study. So I would imagine sometime in that area.
Okay, thank you. We're receiving some questions about the regulatory review, and whether or not, so will the regulatory review include assessment of current flexibility incentive mechanisms? On this particular one, if whomever asked that, if there's any, you could be a little bit more specific. On the mechanisms that you're thinking of. Yeah, we'll monitor the chat if it has to do with utility program incentives or VEDR. We can ask Brattle to weigh in, or Ryan to weigh in on whether those types of incentives are included in the phase 1 portion of the project.
Yeah, I mean, what I can say on that is, we have been conducting these stakeholder interviews to develop a qualitative understanding of the barriers and potential solutions, and that definitely has come up, right? The complexity associated with monetizing the full value stack of grid flexibility has come up as a barrier. I think solutions that have been proposed have been creating a VEDR-like tariff that is available more broadly to all demand side resources that allow that value stack to be monetized. Some of the conversations have flagged, some of the issues that have come up or have been raised in the chat today, related to bidirectional tariffs and trying to streamline the ability to monetize the value of distributed batteries. So this is definitely an issue that you will see addressed in the phase 1 report. And there will be, at least at a high level, some potential solutions being teed up there. That phase 1 report, as you just heard, is not where we will be literally proposing a new rate design that is intended to solve these problems. But we will, I think, with that phase 1 report, be establishing the foundation that will then, I think, probably be building on in more detail in the phase 3 work. And I guess, maybe to kind of round this out, maybe where you were going next, Karen, is there's also the question of regulatory incentives for utilities to be pursuing grid flexibility opportunities and performing in that regard. That's also separately an issue we've explored through those barriers and solutions conversations. So there will be some similar treatment of that aspect of this work as well.
Great, thanks, Ryan. And I think we did get some clarification that the incentive mechanisms were what we addressed: utility programs, VEDR, non-wire alternative mechanisms. So things that are all part of the phase 1 portion of the study. We are getting a couple of questions coming in on will the flexible targets or flex targets be adjusted with any potential changes to the CLCPA targets? Any insight on how this work impacts or could be impacted by changes to the CLCPA?
Well, I think it's an interesting question, but it's hard to answer right now since we don't actually have targets established and can't really speak to any relationships between flexibility, deployment targets that are developed sometime in the future in this proceeding versus the targets in the CLCPA. This commenter may have been kind of referencing the open CES midpoint or CES review period that where staff filed a report indicating that the 70 by 30 target may be a challenge to achieve given the current state of the market. So I mean, those are really big questions where we don't have clarity on either side at this point. So I mean, I don't think we can give a specific answer, but the Grid of the Future proceeding as one of those overarching proceedings is definitely the forum to, I guess, think about that type of problem if it should emerge. So I'm sorry, that's kind of a non-answer, but I don't think we can give more clarity at this point. And while I'm off mute, I think Ed asked a follow-up question to the CGPP response that I gave about creating new headroom for DG. I guess staff's position is that the Accelerated Renewable Growth and Community Benefit Act, which is where the CGPP stemmed from, really does impose requirements that the utilities do planning for both their local transmission systems and distribution systems to enable the targets of the CLCPA. And that distribution system planning is in fact in scope for CGPP, which is where I come back to, if it's not working at an advanced or suitable level for you, I think, and it needs to be more, if we need to, come up with new frameworks and methods, it's certainly relevant to identify that in the Grid of the Future proceeding and refer to CGPP and say it needs to change in this way. We would really welcome those kinds of comments in response to, I'd say any of the filings, but I think the phase 2 DSIP evaluation would be a natural place for that type of comment to be filed. So hopefully that's helpful. I think I can understand that you would want more in CGPP than what you're seeing, right? It's much more static what we're doing for distributed generation, because the kind of the planning tools don't do a good job of differentiating between distributed and bulk generation resources, and we would welcome feedback and advice for how we could do it better.
Great. Well, thank you. I think we've got time for just a couple of more. So going back to the process that we're in right now with the DSIP and the Grid of the Future study, question came in: how is the Grid of the Future study, DSIPs, and the regulatory review connected? And then just to prepare DPS, there'll be a follow-up question on that. Does staff anticipate proposed changes in the DSIP communication formats and or pathways? So Teague, I see you up ready
Yeah,
to
I can
tackle the
take the
first part of
first
the question.
part. So this work on assessing the DSIPs and then doing the regulatory review is all foundational work to understand, our current status and where we need to evolve the different processes going into creating, our first iteration of the grid of the future as well as the second. So again, the regulatory review is really identifying where there's still substantial barriers in the market that need to be addressed. That is really good information for us in saying, okay, if we're trying to achieve X, we need to also focus on some of the regulatory efforts to help achieve it. And then, again, the DSIP assessments, right? Understanding the DSIPs are a core mechanism to achieving the grid of the future. It's not the only mechanism, but we want to make sure that that mechanism is most effectively used going into that grid of the future plan. And then, yeah, Kelly, if others want to add to that.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is that the results of the phase 1 are going to be really important, especially the barriers work, and Ryan can jump in here to help identify how and where the DSIPs need to evolve going forward. And I think sort of pulling all these 3 things together will really help us to lay the foundation that will allow us to allow phase 3, to really develop that vision and roadmap. And along with that, the key elements piece that we're doing as part of the DSIP, so really sort of understanding what's really critical in order to move the DSIPs forward, and in order to move the utilities toward that grid of the future state. I don't know, Ryan, if you want to jump in on other things from phase 1, or if we're good.
Yeah, no, not much to add. I mean, I would just say, part of the reason we've been conducting the interviews and doing the survey is to identify the barriers and potential solutions. But a focus of all of that has been not just on coming up with a big laundry list of 800 barriers, but also trying to understand from the perspective of the people who are on the ground trying to make this happen today, what are the priorities? Like, what are the barriers that are really holding us back? What are the solutions that feel like no-brainer solutions, both in terms of impact and feasibility? And so really, like, in addition to this just kind of being foundational research at this point, it is also intended to give us a degree of prioritization so that, as Kelly was just saying, we know where to focus the efforts of the subsequent phases.
Okay, thank you. Does staff want to weigh in on how the process might change moving forward regarding communications, etc.?
This is Andy, staff. I think if the question is there the possibility of changes to the DSIP process and changes to the guidance as to the content and structure of the DSIPs and things like that, that's all on the table. We're looking forward to hearing what comes out of DNV in terms of their recommendations, but we're wide open to seeing where there are opportunities to make the process more effective over time.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Okay, we have another question that came in that we'll address, and this one I'll turn over to Zarai. Could you please clarify the relationship between the CGPP and proactive grid planning procedure?
Yeah, that's a good question. The initiating order for the proactive planning for electrification proceeding, which is a proceeding where we are developing a framework, a modeling framework to predict electrification load and identify T&D upgrades needed to support electrification load for buildings and transportation. The initiating order asked essentially, the utilities to consider and include in their filings an approach to integrating that planning framework in the coordinated grid planning process. And so we really think of the coordinated grid planning process as our integrated resource plan for the state that we do on a recurring basis. And as I think it's a really good parallel to our discussion or the questions that we've received about hosting capacity for distributed energy resources. In the case of the current coordinated grid planning process, it uses a tops-down load forecast that is not very good at identifying specific feeders and substations on the distribution system that will need to be upgraded. And electrification load can show up really, really quickly in ways that really outpace the existing 3-year planning cycle. And an anecdote that I observed recently is I was looking at a substation at an upstate utility who has an open pending rate case right now with projects that they were aware of as of last year. Is when I think they made their filing. And since that filing, about 10 megawatts of mostly medium and heavy duty charging load has shown up on a substation. So like the plans that are in a rate case that we're negotiating right at this moment are missing a massive amount of electrification and the need for an upgrade. That's not, hypothetical load. It's load letter applications for real projects. So, I mean, that's just a case where a new planning methodology or framework is needed to better anticipate those kinds of loads. And we're doing that in the proactive planning proceeding. Once we have a robust framework, we can integrate that into our traditional planning process. Something like that may be helpful for DG generation, or maybe not. Maybe it's a more straightforward problem. But I think Grid of the Future is a good forum to flag those types of concerns. And I would also say for electrification loads, Grid of the Future is where we want to find ways to minimize the amount of infrastructure we have to build for electrification. And we did a study, we as in DPS and NYSERDA did a study that was published in 2022 that observed that about $37 billion worth of distribution substation upgrades would be needed due to electrification by 2050. And we could eliminate about $14 billion worth of those upgrades with widespread adoption of flexible load from the electrification. So there's a massive opportunity for customers if we can encourage managed charging and vehicle to grid. And Grid of the Future is really where that type of issue is best addressed.
All right. Thank you, Sarai. I think we've come to the end of our questions, so I'd like to thank the audience for participating and providing such great questions, and for our panelists for being ready and on the spot to give nice, thorough answers. I'll do a quick reminder that the recording will be available on DMM and the DPS web page. And turn it over, I guess, Kelly, do you want to close us out officially out of the forum?
Yeah,
Anything
sure.
else?
Sure. I guess we'll just thank everybody for joining us. It was really great to have an opportunity to share the work that we're doing with you all. And we're looking forward, both us and the Brattle team, to sharing more results after the holidays. So thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.